Hi everyone, I am here with a story for you, a true story. Where miracles happen, true stories of heavenly encounters. And this one by Francis Thompson, The Hound of Heaven. He's got a quote before the story that says, "All fondest, blindest, weakest, I am he whom thou sleekest." I like rhyming poems. In the midst of battle. By the time Albert Leo entered college and began studying for a career in science, he was ready to discredit organized religions, but God was still at work in his life. As time passed, I kept having experiences that could not be explained by science, Albert says. It became clear to me that all of reality cannot be replaced under a microscope, sent through a cyclotron, or bombarded with electromagnetic radiation to be measured, plotted, and classified. Albert, however, was still a self-described hard-headed GI in 1944 when he and his fellow infantrymen slogged through the snow, the mud, and the Vosges Mountains. They had fought some smaller skirmishes with the German army, but casualties had been high. Nearly 1/4 of their company was now sick, wounded, or dead. Usually we'd march through the night, attack a German-held town at dawn, then occupy houses and dig defensive positions on the outskirts, Albert explains. Toward the end of December, the company commander decided to change methods. A night patrol would penetrate the next town, legion, and capture prisoners for interrogation. Albert was one of the two advanced scouts. Albert had already had a number of close calls, but that evening he experienced a deep foreboding, a certainty that he wouldn't be coming back. So strong was the feeling that he left his valuables behind with a buddy. Instead of helmets, the two soldiers put on white parkas so that they would blend in with the snow. Then, carrying grenade launchers, they inched down the half-mile hill from the line to a house. It was empty, so they signaled the rest of the squad to move up and around it. "Remember, one blow of my whistle means you return to the house," the squad leader reminded everyone. "Two blasts means everyone retreats to the line." Albert and the other scouts pressed forward again, moving in a half-crouch now, across 200 yards of open area toward the village. "Albert," the other scout whispered about 2/3 of the way across. "I saw something. I'm going back to talk to the squad leader." "Sure." While the other scout made his way back to the house, Albert lay motionless, hoping he couldn't be seen. Soon, rifle fire sounded. Rifle fire sounded in front of him from the village wall. The first few rounds didn't come close to Albert. He was sure he was sufficiently camouflaged, but since then there was a woodpile to his left. He decided to run for it. Just as he did, something flashed from the wall, and a second later his whole world burst into blazing stars. Albert felt himself being lifted from the waist. "So this is how it feels to get hit," he thought. Strangely, as he slipped into darkness, he felt no panic, no deep regrets, just peace and the presence of God. Time passed. Dimly, Albert realized that he wasn't dead after all, but still lying in the snow. Gradually, he moved different parts of his body and discovered that his right arm didn't work. With his left, Albert pushed back his parka hood and clumsily shoved some snow onto the throbbing right temple. He had probably sustained a minor flesh wound. If he had been wearing a helmet rather than a parka, he probably wouldn't have injured at all. Bad luck. Firing had stopped, and Albert seemed to be the only human on the silent landscape. Somehow he managed to crawl the remaining distance to the woodpile and prop himself up behind it. Any minute one of his buddies would rescue him. It was just a matter of staying conscious until then. But he heard nothing. Not until a piercing whistle broke the silence. One blast. Albert's heart sank. His company commander was calling the scouts back to the house. Dry mouth. When Albert didn't show up, everyone would assume the rifle fire had killed him. A few moments later, Albert's worst fears were realized. The whistle blew twice. His squad was moving back to the line, leaving him alone. Well, almost alone. Somewhere behind the wall there was still the German soldier who had shot him. 20 minutes passed without a sound. Albert's head wound was still bleeding, and he knew he could freeze to death. Surrender was probably his only option. In his best high school German, he called into the stillness, "I need help. I'm ready to give up." No one answered. Did the enemy soldier think it was a trap? Albert couldn't blame him, but he couldn't wait until morning to surrender either. By then, the German would find only a corpse. Instead, Albert stood up behind the woodpile and to his great surprise found he could walk. Then why surrender? Maybe he could make it back to his company. Weaving, staggering, sometimes falling, Albert made it to the empty house. Panting, he collapsed on the ground for a moment and pushed more snow onto the wound in his forehead. Then, dragging himself upright, he wobbled down the hill. "I wasn't sure of the route back and had forgotten the password," he says, "so I kept calling out that I was a GI and needed help." Sorry guys, my mouth gets so dry, I'm sorry. No one responded. The exhausting journey seemed to take forever. Through his pain and fear, Albert heard gunfire from where he had come. But finally, an arm reached out of the darkness. "Come on, buddy," a voice said. "I'll help you to the aid station." He had made it. Later, the hospital doctor asked Albert what had happened. And when Albert described his journey, the doctor smiled and shook his head. "No way, soldier. Someone must have carried you. There's not one chance in 100,000 that you could have walked alone back to that house." "Why not?" Albert asked. "It was just a flesh wound, wasn't it?" "A flesh wound? The hole in your skull was 3 inches across. If you had been wearing a helmet instead of a parka, that piece of shrapnel would have bounced under the metal and killed you." Albert was confounded, and he had thought the parka was bad luck. "Anyway, soldier, you couldn't have remained conscious, not with your head open," the doctor continued. "And if you had passed out for a length of time, you would have died from shock, loss of blood, and freezing." "Nope," he shook his head. "There's no explanation for why you're going to live." They don't know. They don't know. That's exactly what happened to him. They can't say that he couldn't because it did. Albert lay back, eyes wide. He was thinking of what the other scout had told him moments after he had collapsed behind the line, when Albert had gasped, "Why didn't you give me some covering fire?" "We would have, but we didn't know how many Germans were behind the pillbox," the other scout had explained. "We all went back to the line to fire on it. There wasn't any pillbox around," Albert had argued. "Yes, there was, just to the left of you." "There was a wood pile," Albert explained. "The shots came from the wall, not there. I hid behind it waiting for you." The two soldiers looked at each other. "We fired on it," the other scout said softly. "If you had still been there, we would have killed you." Albert Leo went on to become a project director at the Sieber Chemistry Laboratory in Claremont, California, still deeply scientific and deeply spiritual as well. And from time to time, he remembers the episode in Lingen. Was it just a coincidence that he was wearing a parka rather than a helmet? That the snow he packed into a seemingly fatal head wound kept him alive? Was it only his legs that carried him over 200 open yards, then a half-mile up a snow-covered hill? Where and how do we encounter God? Albert asks. He is present when we least expect him. Amen. He is present with us all the time. Just gotta believe this. A lot of times you just don't know it until something like that happens, and then you're like, was that God? Yes, because he's there with you all the time. He's there to help you. He's there with you. Remember, Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. You can do all things through Jesus who gives you strength. Jesus and God are always with you. Never, ever forget that. They have your back. Talk to them. They're there. They would love to talk to you. They would love for you to talk to them. They know what you're thinking. They know what's in your heart. Just let it out. Let your feelings out. It's a wonderful feeling. It really is. I hope you guys have a good night.